So, of course, when we did win, I never expected Stephen Harper to say, interesting judgment. We'll take this up in caucus and come up with a new plan. That's what should have happened, okay? Because the law does not work. It's dysfunctional. It doesn't even matter what side of the equation you're on. Everybody agrees that it's dysfunctional. But the government knee-jerk appeals these things, so they buy time. We fast-tracked it. We got a decision last October. We're in court next week. That's fast. Now I got to slow track it to the Supreme Court of Canada, considering that we just got a majority government that was going to respond to this case. So I may have to wait for the next generation to take it up to the Supreme Court of Canada. But regardless of your ideological predisposition, everyone I've ever met doing this case will say the law sucks. Whether you're a prohibitionist and you want to get tougher, whether you're an abolitionist, whether you're a libertarian, no one feels the law works. Now, when I went to court, I couldn't really stand up and say, Your Honor, the law sucks. So, which is what you want to say, but you can't, because in law you got to dress it up in fancy language for them to listen. So the reality was, you look through the academic literature, the following words were recurring themes or motifs all the time: inconsistent, irrational, hypocritical, and self-defeating. Almost everybody uses those expressions, and the test for me was how to convert those expressions into a recognizable constitutional doctrine. I'll get to that in a minute, but I'd like to talk a little bit about how do we end up with such a dog's breakfast? And this is a personal opinion, because I don't know how these things happen. They say the two things you don't want to see made are sausages and legislation, okay? So I'm not sure exactly what happened here, but here's what I think I know, because I've actually done a lot of work in the sex trade and in the pornography industry earlier in the 80s. Despite the sexual revolution of the 60s, despite the fact that Sex and the City was an HBO, success, the reality is I still find we're very confused and somewhat hypocritical when it comes to matters of sexuality. Even the most progressive people, there's just something about it, the sanctity of it, I'm not sure, the hedonistic nature of it. It makes our responses rather strange. And when you look at the sex trade, the big picture historically, you just see this fluctuation between periods of tolerance, periods of condemnation, we keep going back and forth, and what we don't talk about, periods of praise, because we haven't been there for a long time. But the sacred temple harlots of ancient Greece were really in the upper echelon of society, the geisha culture of Japan. And quite frankly, you wouldn't be listening to some of that really nice 19th century French piano music or looking at those impressionistic painters if those self-indulgent artists didn't have those very powerful madams in Paris to help them through their neuroses, basically. So there's been a lot of periods. There's been a lot of periods where we've actually praised sex work. Canada inherited the British tradition, which has never praised sex work. It's always gone between condemnation, the white slave trade of the late 19th century, to tolerance, we don't really care, this is a good thing for society, we'll turn a blind eye. That's what we inherited. And we've seen that. We don't talk about the sex trade for decades, and then suddenly there's some moral panic that's created. Well, we were in the middle of a moral panic, and that's what gave rise to this case. It was a false crisis created in the late 70s for a number of reasons. Very odd. The law against street prostitution was called soliciting. The Supreme Court of Canada in 1978, in a case called Hutt, trying to be progressive, interpreted soliciting to mean pressing and persistent. What that meant was you could never enforce the law, because any sex worker with any wherewithal would know, I'm going to be a polite sex worker, and that makes it legal. And that's really what it was. As long as you didn't bug people on the street, you couldn't be prosecuted. At the same time that was happening, the RCMP and a few other police forces were targeting indoor locations. And you might remember the tragedy of the Manuel Jacques Shoeshine killing in Toronto, which led to the cleaning up, so-called, of a lot of indoor body houses. Well, at the same time the court was giving almost a license to sex workers on the street, sex workers were being pushed out onto the street from the indoor locations. Suddenly everybody noticed. We have a problem in this country, we must do something about it. And it was a conservative government that was given the mandate to do something about it. And it was a Minister of Justice, you may remember, named John Crosbie. I say no more. Okay? I don't need to be disrespectful, but if you know John Crosby, you know where I'm going. So, he's the one who came up with the communication law. And his message was really simple. We got to clear the streets. The municipalities are really clamoring for change. Well, we're going to say you can't communicate on the street, which is our message is get off the street. Well, what a beautiful little bit of myopia, really. Think about it. Get off the street, where are you going to go? Crosby and the Conservative government had to realize if they're going to push people off the street, which I don't think is a bad thing, you've got to open up other locations. You can't have it as a contradiction that if you move indoors, it's a more serious criminal offense. So they upped the stakes when you actually try to get off the street. So the question became immediately in 1985, what can we do constitutionally about a law that makes no sense, that's inconsistent and irrational? People were very excited about the charter in the early days. Lawyers, I don't know if people were, but lawyers were. And immediately, challenges were brought to the communication law that were premature and half-baked. They shouldn't have been brought, but we were just very excited to get a ruling on this. And in 1990, on an incomplete record, the Supreme Court of Canada upheld these laws, which is why I had to wait as long as I did to revisit this. But the court really did signal there was a problem. I think the Chief Justice of Canada called the laws bizarre. That's not something judges say very often, by the way. Lemaire called it odd. So we knew there was the seeds, but nothing could be done. They upheld the law. But between 1993 and 2003, some remarkable things happened. One very good and one very tragic. New constitutional doctrines emerged as the Charter evolved that allowed us to challenge the rationality of law. That's the good news. The bad news was new facts were emerging about what was going on the streets of Canada, and they were horrifying. I mean, really, there was times when I was doing this case, I wanted to just shut the lights and sit in the dark for hours, realizing some of the things that were going on in my country. In any event, on the law, what happened was the doctrines of arbitrariness, overbreadth, all got developed after the prostitution reference in 1990. And then in one of my cases, I was given a gift. When I challenged the marijuana prohibition, went up to the Supreme Court of Canada, they said, no, you can't challenge the law by saying marijuana is not harmful. That's not a good argument. But you can challenge the law by saying it's grossly disproportionate, that it causes way more harm than good. And I'm listening to this and thinking, okay, I lost this big case that I really wanted some success in, but thank you. Because I'm coming back in a decade and using your words and throwing them back at you, and let's see what you say about it then. Because as soon as I heard that, I realized that was my key to enter into the review of the sex trade. Because the reality is most of the studies showed the laws were not achieving their purpose, they were just moving bodies around. And here's the bad news. The facts started to emerge of escalating violence. When John Crosby introduced this, it was pretty uniform. In committee, people were saying, you're just going to cause harm to sex workers. You're just going to put them into more isolated areas. And he just said, no, that's not going to happen. And now time has proven him to be incorrect. The government, in fact, commissioned studies to look at this because researchers tell them there's a problem. They get reports that come back and say there is a problem. There is escalating violence on the streets. We should do something about it. Statistics Canada, as of the year 2000, calls the sex trade an occupation at risk. That's the category. It's got a special category. Who else is there? Taxi drivers and police officers. You want to do the numbers? The murders of sex workers, it's got to be at least 20 times higher than taxi drivers and police officers. I don't have the exact figure. I've never calculated it. So we realize there's a problem, and then everything changed in 2002. And I remember watching the television when they started digging up the pig farm in Port Coquitlam, right? And I'm looking at this, and I thought, now's the time, because Canada will now understand what happens when you leave people isolated with the only location they can legally work is on the street without communicating. The Picton case did shock and horrify people. I'd say most Canadians didn't see the victims as sex workers. They didn't really see the issue yet. But I knew in bringing the case and using this information, we would be able to achieve something.